Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessikah. I am one of your hosts today. I'm joined by...
Hello, I'm Jen. Happy to be here.
And yeah, we're really excited to have our guest. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your book.
I'm Molly Greeley. We're talking about Marvelous, my third book, which is about the real-life Renaissance couple who may have been the inspiration for the fairy tale Beauty and the Beast.
It was marvelous is a good word for it. Jen, go ahead, because I can see that you wanted to jump in right away.
Oh, yeah, I really loved this book. It was so fascinating and so beautifully written. And my first question is kind of about the structure, because I really enjoyed that. And it was something that I don't really encounter a lot, like when I read fiction, especially historical fiction these days. And I'm wondering what inspired you to take this sort of like long view that you take with how like the book is structured?
So this, to be honest, the structure was something I struggled with quite a bit. I definitely knew that I wanted both Pedro and Catherine to be narrators, and tell their own stories, but or third person version of their own stories. But I guess because the Renaissance is something like the politics of the time are so complex, and so I wanted to get that in there, but in a way that didn't make it the focus of the story, because in my mind the focus of the story was this family. And so it just kind of felt like, okay, so it was partly to do with wanting to get the politics in, because it started out with me actually having Antoinette, one of the daughters, as a narrator as well. And she came in order to kind of, from her adult perspective, give the reader some of the background as to what was going on politically. And quite rightly, my agent looked at this and was like, you know what, this is a little bit of a mess. And so we talked about restructuring it, taking her out, and I had to weave all of the politics back in. But I wanted to make sure that Pedro and Catherine's, basically their life together, was the main focus of the story. And I wanted to jump off with Pedro's death, with the end of their marriage, because from the beginning I wanted readers to understand that they loved each other. It was one of those things that I didn't want to be a surprise later on. Like, I wasn't looking to make this a question of whether their marriage ended up working. As complex as it ended up being, I wanted you to have a reason to root for them, I guess, like to understand that they wanted to be together in the end.
So this is considered the true story that inspired Beauty and the Beast. So this takes place in the time Catherine de Medici is the queen, and her late husband had bought and raised Pedro. He has how do you pronounce it?
Hypertrichosis.
Yes, hypertrichosis. Yes. Which means that he is covered from head to toe with hair. He looks like what a depiction of a werewolf would have been in, like the Universal Monster Age movies. But he is a person, and several people have been documented to have had this. I know P.T. Barnum employed a lot of them, quote unquote, employed in his freak shows. There's actually a very famous internet cat named, I think his name is Axchum, that actually has this. He is adorable. Yeah, he's adorable. I highly recommend you looking him up. He's awesome.
Going to.
Yeah, but this young man, he came into the court, and the king sort of took a fascination with him because, you know, at first they're like, well, this child, he was like about 10 years old, they think, when they first got, is wild. He's a, you know, one of the forest people. He's a wild beast. And really, he was just a very scared little boy who wanted what every child wants, love and a family. And the king raised him as a noble person. And then after his passing, Catherine de Medici was like, I'm going to marry him off to somebody beautiful.
Yep, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. Yeah. And I mean, so it's one of those, there are a lot of historians out there who, you know, posit the idea that was the inspiration to the Beauty and the Beast, because that, which was written, you know, not in that time, but approximately, it was in, I believe, the 1600s was when the original was written. And so, it's not for certain. Like, I want to put that out there. It's not absolutely for certain that this was the inspiration, but it's very likely that the writer would have known of Catherine and Pedro, because in his time he was a well-known figure. And so, but yeah, it's kind of fascinating how similar the stories are, in that, you know, the wife has, you know, some choice in the marriage, but not, you know, just like Beauty in the story has, you know, a choice whether she wants to stay in the castle, but it's not really much of a choice. Given the time period, she had very few options. And so I guess the way I looked at it was, he was not held by a spell. He was never going to be released from his appearance. I mean, that was just the way he was born. But but yet he was held in the palace, in court life nonetheless. I mean, he kind of, it was like what was he going to do out in the world? Unfortunately, in a way, you know, court life was like a cage, but it also kind of shielded him, I think, from the rest of the world, because you know, human marvels, for lack of a better term, were something that were like commodities. They were traded in by, you know, the nobility of the time, and, you know, it was like a mark of status to have them at your court. So people who lived at court presumably were used to having unusual people around them, and it wasn't as big a deal as if he went out into the rest of the world.
I really like that the novel addresses that so complexly, because it is absolutely true that, like, yeah, courts did sort of collect people the way that they built menageries, you know, as sort of like marvels that showed off their wealth and their status and things. And I think that, you know, to mention what you mentioned before, the fact that you lead with their love, you know, and like the ultimate happiness that they found in their marriage, sort of I think restores a lot of like agency and dignity to him as a character, you know, because it's not, you know, off the bat that it's not going to be a book that is just about his suffering and his marginalization and ostracization from society. Like, he's going to be treated as a person with all of the complexity that entails. And so was that like a sort of intentional reason that also drove those choices?
Very much so. I didn't want it to be a story about, you know, someone who had an unusual appearance. I didn't want it to just be about someone's appearance, and that, you know, and how, I think there are so many times when people who have, you know, physical differences, they're like you said, they're depicted as just being bullied, as being just having really difficult lives as a result of this. And because, you know, we knew that he was a real person. Obviously, we don't know for certain what kind of marriage they had, but in my imagination, it was a good one. We know that they had children together, at the very least, quite a few children. And I wanted, I mean, dignity is the right word. I wanted him to be a full and complete human being, and not to be, not to just be his hair. I mean that, yeah. You said it better than I did. Because I really, really did want to give him the dignity of a complex inner life, and family life.
Thank you. Yeah, like in a lot of ways, sort of the tone reminded me of David Lynch's The Elephant Man, where like the focus isn't his abnormality from our perspective, it's how the way he is treated shapes him as a person and how he still manages to create some aspects of a fulfilling life for himself, even though there's a lot of tragedy too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So when you were writing Catherine, how much is known about her specifically? So we know obviously that they were married, and her father was, I believe, a merchant or a servant
A
of
merchant. Yeah.
yes. So, it was obviously, as you mentioned, it was like a no choice.
Mhm.
And we've also heard from several sources that Catherine de' Medici was not looked as the kindest person. No, which we can get into a little bit later. But how much is actually known about like the real Catherine?
Not a lot. I mean, I guess kind of like a lot of women who were not, the Catherine de' Medici's of the world, like the cat, the people who the very few women who had real power in the world. History doesn't record a lot about everyday women, and Catherine really was, as far as we know, a very normal, everyday kind of woman. All we know is that her father was a merchant. Very probably the draper to the queen, although I'm not positive about that. Um, and we know that she had at least 7 children with Pedro and that she married him. That's really all we know about her. We have one portrait of her that probably was not actually painted from life. The historian who was talking about it said that it was very likely that most of these portraits were actually drawn like sketches, and then the paintings were created later. So we don't even know if her coloring is the same as it was in the painting. We don't know.
Is that the painting with her hand on his shoulder?
Yep.
Yes, because I was doing some research and that's the only one I could find. Yes.
Yeah. I did find there's a painting of a young girl when I was doing initial research into this. There's a painting of a young girl that is often on the internet used as a picture of Catherine, but as far as I can tell, that's not actually a picture of her. I think it's just a young girl in a yellow dress. But the one with her and Pedro is the only known for sure one. Yeah.
That like actually reminds me of a question I had too, which is like about writing fiction about people who are on the historical record. And I'm wondering, like, is it harder to write someone like Catherine de' Medici, who has a lot of records that you have to fictionalize around? Or is it harder to write somebody like the other Catherine, who is not as well documented and who you have a lot more room to play with?
For me, people who are better documented are definitely more difficult. Um, I always want to stay as close to what is known as possible. And if a lot is known, then that's a lot that you need to make sure to try to put in. I guess because to me personally, it feels like there's a lot of responsibility in writing about real people, and it's not as if anything I write is guaranteed to be true, no matter how hard I try. But I definitely felt a little audacious writing, trying to write the inner lives of people who really lived. But it was easier to just let my imagination go when it was someone like Catherine, about whom we know very little. Yeah.
Did you, when you were writing Pedro's parts, did you feel a little bit differently? Because I mean, as mentioned, we know very little about Catherine. We know a little bit more about him, though.
We do. So he was the subject of a biography, an Italian biographer that I read, and it's this biographer he posited that Pedro was very, very, very interested in having like meaningful work, that he didn't want to just stand around and be Harry. And so that's something that I want to make sure I put into this book. It was hard for me to put together who Pedro was initially, because I didn't want him to be, unless there was something that I found that indicated this, but there wasn't. I didn't want him to just be a very sad person. I mean, I wanted, like we talked about, I wanted him to be, complex. And so the idea that he was interested in having this meaningful work, there was I believe a document that where he did request when they moved to Italy, he requested work specifically from the Duke that they, the Farnese family. And I mean, that just to me spoke to him wanting to be part of the world in a way, and also just wanting his own. He wanted dignity is the way I saw it, and to be seen as a person with worth and something to give beyond his appearance. But I definitely did have a hard time trying to kind of cobble together from these little bits and pieces that we knew about him who I thought he might actually be like inside.
Especially when I imagine like that a lot of those sources were probably pretty like biased against him and not particularly interested in him as a person, like because so many times you have to also battle like the perspective of the person providing the source that you're using.
That's very, very true. And I feel like with him in particular, there's not a lot of writing about him that talks about his interiority. It's all about, like there was a who was it? I think it was someone who, I don't remember who it was. It was someone in the French court who, when Pedro was brought to the court in a cage, as a gift to the king, they documented like what he smelled like, where he was hairiest. They talked about all of his different body parts. Like that was the kind of information there was, like the color of his hair, the texture of his hair, like, but there was very little about who he was as a person. So, and then, when you go online to less uh, reliable sources, there's a lot of speculation, and it is easy to get pulled into that, I think, and to what people's opinions might be. Like, like even just the picture of Pedro and Catherine that you talked about with her hand on the shoulder, there are a lot of people who say that is a good indication that they were in love, that she was touching him. And I guess to my mind, we don't know that. It could be that's how the painter imagined them. It could be that's how they were posed. When you're dealing with such a dearth of like historical information, I think it's easy to take little tiny details and blow them up and make a big deal out of them when we don't actually know for certain anything. Really, there's so little that we know for certain about these people.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the servants that served Pedro.
Mm-hmm.
So where did they all come from? So obviously, the servants that served him, there were people they didn't they didn't necessarily not fit into the menagerie that Pedro himself was in. Do we know much about that?
No, and I don't know if servant is the right word for him, but the only person we know anything about really was his keeper, for lack of a better word, who I can't think of his first name, but Monsieur de la Vacherie, I believe was his name. And he is an interesting figure because in those days, apparently both the animals in the menagerie had keepers and children had keepers, and it was the same word, the same French word was used for both. And I don't speak French, so I butcher all the French pronunciation, but it was the same word for both. And so there was a lot of speculation in the books that I was reading about him as to whether the fact that he had one of these keepers was because he was a child or because they thought of him as an animal. And it could have been either one. But he was really the only person who I found anything about who dealt with Pedro on a regular basis. And so he would have been responsible for like keeping track of the costs of Pedro's clothing and making sure that Pedro had tutors and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, the word was very interesting because it's just another question mark as to how he was perceived in his time.
One thing that I also really appreciate about like the perspective you take in the novel too is that because you take this long view I mentioned before, where you sort of like drop us in and out of like moments, in their lives, like on a longer scale. It's the narrative is like, I hope I phrase this correctly. Not so much about like, it is about, the role that his appearance plays in their marriage, obviously, and how that like is something that has to be accommodated, like when they're getting to know each other. But it's also kind of about like what any extremely high profile marriage in a court would be like. Was like, what is it like to be married to somebody when like so much of it is a public performance, and in addition to like the private moments, and like that, what that does to a relationship. Was that something that you also like thought about during this, or?
Yes, it was. I mean, well, it was especially because it did, as I was writing it, it did start to dawn on me. Performance is the perfect word, because I feel like that was, they spent a lot of time, the courtiers, just waiting for the king to tell them what to do, or to get, waiting for a way to serve the king. And in that there was a lot of like political jostling. There was a lot of um trying to get as close to the royal family as possible, and the way that you and your marriage were perceived, I'm sure was part of, could be part of that. It I was, thinking of Pedro's friend Ludovico Gonzaga, and he was a real person, and his marriage, I mean, from the little I found, his wife didn't come to court as often as he did, and so even that, it was just kind of the fact that he was free to kind of do what he wanted. His wife stayed home with the children, but their relationship was very much a political one. I mean, she brought a lot to the table as far as property and money goes, and I think that in those times, all of that would be noticed by the people around you, and I imagine there was judgment on the states of various marriages, and the reasons people married, or all of that.
Yeah, and I was thinking in general, one of the things I really liked when you were writing the relationship between Pedro and Catherine was, Catherine was kind of like, she was like, "Oh, why aren't you bringing me more into court? Why aren't you and he had a completely different perspective of it. And even though he was brought to court for a specific reason, she was brought to court and married to him because of who he was, and because, there was like this ulterior motive almost from the queen mother at that point, I suppose.
Right. Yeah.
So, it was interesting how, when you're writing, you wrote the build up to their relationship, these misunderstandings that, she was like, "Well, I'm here at court. Why aren't I here at court?" And he's just like, "You don't really, it's not all that nice of a
He didn't
place."
really want to be at court. It was kind of his, yeah. And that's something that I don't know about him. I wonder how interested he was in politics. I wrote it so that he didn't want to get involved, that it was a little bit, I mean, I think he could see the pitfalls of that. And because, if you back the wrong horse at court, basically, and then the power dynamic shift, then that's a problem. And so for him, I think it was easier just to kind of, at least in my book, it was easier to just stay in the background and try to keep safe. And yes, but she was a young girl who was at a royal court, and she, wanted to be part of it in the beginning, at least.
Yeah, it was like, in a way, she was like, "Okay, but I was married to somebody high profile, and I'm here." And it's like, it was like she was lonely, and she
Mhm.
wanted to sort of figure out a place, and like he had a completely different experience, and
Right.
view of it. It was just written really well.
Thank you. Yeah. I think miscommunication and just not understanding each other's perspectives were definitely a reason for, you know, the kind of bumpy start to their to their relationship, along with the, you know, marriage that neither of them was really looking for. But
And I think his perspective is justified too, you know, because like he's in this court that, like, as you said before, is sort of like a gilded cage, you know, where he's like protected, but like at the whim of like a, you know, capricious ruler, you know, so he has to watch what he does and what he says in a way that like she hasn't experienced, and she is this young girl, and the like the court is meant to be seductive and pretty and magical, you know, like that is the appeal that kind of covers the poisonous, treacherous, you know, like stuff that goes on under the
the whole thing. Yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess I envisioned her as, because, you know, we know that she was a teenager when she was married, and we don't know exactly how old she was, but she was a teenager, and um, I just, you know, was trying to imagine the daughter of a merchant, even a wealthy merchant, coming into that, you know, situation with, I kind of imagined her to be a little bit naive as far as what she was getting herself into. Yeah.
That actually was something I appreciated too, because when you know, when her father basically gave her over to the court to have his business debts cleared, I thought so clearly. I was like, gosh, like the Disney version of that, it's like, oh, poor dad, you know, like, and dutiful daughter who does what she's told. But this story has some, like, this version has some room for like WTF dad, like that's a really messed up move, you know.
Yeah, seriously. I think, well, that's one thing about the original Beauty and the Beast. Not, I mean, the Disney version, I guess, kind of softened everything. But, you know, the original one, I mean, it really was very much about a daughter's duty to her father. And you know, daughters listen, they obey, they um you know, when they're told where to go, they go. And that was something that, you know, I know that it can be interesting trying to look at history through like a 21st century lens, where, but I still imagine that a teenage girl who, you know, is not necessarily going to, at least mentally, agree with everything her father wants her to do, especially when it's something as, you know, huge as marrying someone she doesn't want to marry. So
I do like that it has some room for her to at least experience, you know, resistance mentally, even if she does, like, you know, go along with it because that is her role in society. Because even today, like, we all do things that we don't want to, but we don't always do them happily
right,
necessarily.
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think I mean this is just I think that this is just a really good story to tell. Were you just really quickly, and I know this is kind of going around the back the back way, you know, when did you come upon it and when did you decide you wanted to tell this story?
It was actually just before COVID lockdowns. I remember very distinctly, I was sitting in a coffee shop with a friend, and I was editing, doing like final edits for my second book. And in that book, I referenced the fairy tale Sleeping Beauty, and I just kind of wanted to double check on the date that fairy tale was written, to make sure that it made sense in the time period that I was writing. And then somehow in my Google search, this like snippet at the bottom of one of the results mentioned something about the true story of Beauty and the Beast, and I was intrigued, and I clicked on it and just went down a rabbit hole. And I had been working on a different book at the time that wasn't very far into, and I remember turning to my friend and being like, I think I have to write this. It just fascinated me, everything about it.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really great. When is the book out officially on shelves?
February 28th.
February 28th. So it should be, you should like put this either on your reading list on February 14th or, you know, order it or, you know, tell your library you want it as soon as you go out, because it is a really good love story, and it's a historical story, and it's one that I don't think a lot of people know about, or they don't know as much as they should about it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So once again, this was Jessikah with Syosset Library. Our my co-host was.
Bye, I'm Jen. See ya.
And our guest was
Molly Greeley. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, and check out Marvelous when it comes out. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.